Hello, from Cape Town, South Africa. This is Tax Notes Talk.
Welcome to Tax Notes Talk, a podcast from Tax Notes, the leading source of tax news, information, and analysis.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm David Stewart, Editor-in-Chief of Tax Notes Today International. This week, a view from the Baltics. At the end of October, the podcast team traveled to Cape Town, South Africa for the International Fiscal Association Annual Congress. While there, we recorded several interviews, as well as the penguins at Boulders Beach, which you heard at the beginning of the episode. We've been releasing these interviews over the past month, and you can find the other episodes in the show notes. This week's episode features Jānis Taukačs, a partner at Sorainen in Riga, Latvia. Our discussion focuses on the tax priorities of the Baltic region and on Jānis' career in tax. And one note before we get to the interview, since we had to leave the studio for this, the audio may sound a bit different than our usual interviews. All right, let's go to that interview. Jānis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here.
Why don't we start off with talking about the issues of taxation that are most important in the Baltic region?
Unfortunately, the current issue is not so much related to taxation. It's more geopolitical situation that the neighbor we are having next to us. But currently, I would say that if you look at the border between Latvia and Russia, then there has always been a lot of military presence on the Russian side. Now there is nobody, so everybody is in Ukraine. So, of course, this impacts the volume of investments coming in. But from the taxation perspective, I would say Baltics are fairly attractive because they are small, adapting very quickly to the modern tax developments around the world, very digitalized. The tax declarations can be submitted electronically very quickly. If you look at the latest charts on the tax system rankings, then the Baltic states, all three Baltic states are very high on those charts. So quite recently there was one by Tax Foundation. Estonia was first, Latvia was second, and Lithuania was fifth. Basically, all three Baltic states are doing really well from the tax perspective. And I was advising the Minister of Finance with their tax reform quite recently, and basically there were no major changes that we should make at the end of the day in Latvia. As a result of the reform, they made certain changes regarding the payroll taxation, but nothing dramatic. I think this corporate tax regime that we are having, that's really attractive for companies because companies don't pay corporate tax until distribution of profits. Both Estonia and Latvia, we have this very interesting regime. And because of that, many companies are reinvesting their profits to their business without any corporate tax applicable.
So are there other features of these tax systems that are attractive to business?
Well, I would say we are very knowledgeable on IT sector. We have a lot of IT engineers, and for that reason, there are a lot of American investments coming to that particular sector. I would say that's what I have seen from my clients. And for that reason, they are utilizing this corporate income tax regime. They are utilizing, there are special features regarding share options. There are different possibilities regarding free economic zones. And also definitely there are other minor possibilities. But I would say overall, it's the skill and attitude of the labor force that would be even more important than the tax investment scheme or tax investment climate.
So you mentioned a large amount of IT sector, and that is an area that's posing a problem for a lot of countries right now, where we have the OECD project on taxation of the digital economy. What has been the sort of regional reaction or response to the two pillars? Is this something that fits within the tax regimes that they have?
Definitely, that's a big headache everywhere because the whole European Union needs to implement Pillar 2, and Baltic states are no exception. But on the other hand, Baltic states, for example, Latvia has only, I think, 5 or 6 companies which qualify for this 750 million threshold, so as the headquarter. But for that reason, we have extension period, a transitional period until I think it's 2030. Regarding digital service taxation, I'm sure nothing will happen because we are part of NATO and we want to preserve good relations with the US. And for that reason, I think politically nothing will change in that respect, also regarding the US investments there.
So now you said in Latvia there was a tax reform review. There's nothing to do immediately, but are there any sort of long-term goals of things that would need to be implemented to keep this competitive tax system in place?
Well, it's clear they want to preserve this attractive corporate income tax system, and then there was even no debate that this will stay for a long time. And the major focus was on somehow making this labor force, which is low-paid labor force until a couple of €1,000 per month, then how to decrease the taxation level on payroll for those persons working, then maybe counting every euro that they are receiving. And they achieved that aim through the reform. And from that perspective, now the playing field is pretty even in all the Baltic states.
Are there any areas of friction between taxpayers and the tax authority?
Actually, we have a new general director. I actually had general director of Latvia and general director of Estonia on my podcast. So we were discussing that they are both very keen to be as business friendly as possible. So they want to implement all sorts of digitalization possibilities, and they understand that these small economies are really depending on foreign investment and also on the exporting companies. And for that reason, they do whatever it takes to be as friendly as possible. But I would say there are tax disputes, of course, but they're everywhere. But currently, I don't see anything special about our tax dispute arena comparing to the other countries.
Now, you mentioned your podcast, which sort of brings me to the other reason why we wanted to talk to you today, and which is to learn a bit about you, because we found you to be a sort of fascinating practitioner in the world of tax. But just to set the scene, I do like to ask everyone, whenever I get a chance, how did you end up in tax?
I'm asking this same question also to some of my podcast guests as well. And I have to say that I have a pretty similar story to the other guests as well. So basically, I finished the law school, and then I understood I want to do something international. And then I just saw an advertisement by one of the big 4 audit firms, and I applied and got hired. So as simple as that. And from that moment, I just started to learn about tax. I started to learn about customs, and I was a customs practitioner at that moment and developed into taxation. And now it's what I have been doing for 30 years. So everything I've learned, I've learned from the practice, I would say, not from school.
All right, so what are you doing on a daily basis? What sort of client work are you engaged in?
We are largest law firm in the Baltic states, so we are full service firm. So we are doing anything that is necessary for the clients. We have a lot of disputes, as you can imagine. We have a lot of customs issues, transfer pricing, M&A deals, you name it. VAT is very high right now on the agenda, and we try to have specialists in every single area of these different kinds of specialization needs. And I'm trying to manage that tax practice. I've been doing this for more than 20 years now.
So, given all of your day-to-day responsibilities, I sort of find it fascinating that you've decided to take on a significant amount of outside work. I understand you have a Substack that you run?
I do, yeah.
What do you do on there?
That's sort of one of my hobbies. Just so I am waking up quite early, 5 a.m. in the morning, and then the first thing I do, I try to write something. Either that's a blog or I'm writing a book, legal/tax thriller. So it's another hobby I have. So and these podcasts have been a big revelation for me as well. So these all are like, I can say that these are my hobbies, so to say.
All right, we will get to the podcast, but I can't let that pass without asking you about your book. Can you tell me more about this?
The idea has been in my mind for some 5 years already. I'm compiling real-life tax fraud cases, and I'm trying to mix this into a story. There has been a very harsh case for one of my clients that has been biggest inspiration for the story, regarding the bribing within the tax authorities and quite nasty things related to that. But I'm developing this as a story developing throughout the world. And then I just hired a writing coach from Scotland to help me with the plot. So it's been developing nicely.
Okay, so let's now talk about your podcast. Could you tell me about that?
Well, yeah, it's a side effect from COVID times, I should say, that I've been following for many years. My marketing guru, so to say, Seth Godin, and I attended one of his workshops. Initially, there was a creativity workshop, and then afterwards I saw his podcasting workshop, so I did that as well. And then I met in the podcasting workshop interesting people, and one of them was one of my first persons who I was interviewing, and that's a fascinating story about a guy from Cyprus who was tax partner of the leading Cyprus law firm. And he quit his job and did something completely different. He wrote a book about happiness. He's a sort of a leadership coach. And these kind of stories are so inspiring that life could be open to anything in the world. So, and you meet those people, that's really fascinating.
Absolutely. And who has been the most interesting guest that you've had on your podcast?
Well, I would say Bill Browder was one of the most interesting, definitely, and very relevant in today's geopolitical situation with his story about Magnitsky case in Russia. If somebody has not heard, this is really like important story to hear about and understand what's going on in Russia. But I would say definitely one of the highlights was the former head of OECD tax policy, Pascal Seneman. Absolutely amazing person, and many more. But I don't focus on some big names only. I want to hear the story of the person, and if I'm fascinated by the story, then it could be anybody. It could be a person on the street.
Yeah, absolutely. And for listeners that want to become familiar with the Magnitsky story, we actually can link in the show notes to a news story I wrote many years ago when I was a reporter. It's a fascinating and horrifying story. Bill Browder has been doing a lot of work to try and raise awareness of what happened to his representative in Moscow.
Yeah, and those things are still going on in Russia, in Belarus, for example. Recently, one of my friends, who is one of the leading tax lawyers in Belarus, he was put into prison in Belarus for no reason. and he miraculously escaped from that prison and went to live in Poland and asked for political asylum there. So he's now a political refugee in Poland. So basically this is still going on.
Now, is there any guest that you just really would like to get at this point? Is there somebody that you'd love to be able to talk to on your podcast?
Oh yeah, definitely many. My wish list is John Gershon, of course. My wish list is Seth Godin. My wish list is Dan Nadel in UK. Mm-hmm. So those guys, they are amazing personalities, and I hope one day to talk to them as well.
Well, I think it would be great to hear you talk to them. And thank you so much for coming and talking with me. It's been a great conversation.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting. That's been a pleasure.
And now, coming attractions. Each week we highlight new and interesting commentary in our magazines. Joining me now is Acquisitions and Engagement Editor-in-Chief, Paige Jones. Paige, what will you have for us?
Thanks, Dave. In Tax Notes Federal, 4 staff members with NYU's Tax Law Center explore problematic tax planning strategies that pair granted trust transactions with basis shifting. Nathan Smith considers whether the excitement surrounding interest capitalization is justified. In Tax Note State, Michael Pusick examines the New Jersey Tax Division's position in their recently released technical bulletin on pass-through income sourcing. Alan Braddock examines the recent state transfer pricing enforcement trends. In Tax Notes International, Reuven Aviona and Nessa Nikasida argue that the EU's Court of Justice was misguided in the recent Apple ruling. Samuel Dorhetzo examines the relationship between the environmental costs of mining and the sector's contribution to Ghana's economy. And finally, in featured analysis, Nana Amasarfo discusses recent Kenyan tax legislation meant to replace the country's failed Finance Bill 2024.
That's it for this week. You can follow me online at TaxStew, that's STEW, and be sure to follow at Tax Notes for all things tax. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@taxanalyst.org. And as always, if you like what we're doing here, please leave a rating or review wherever you download this podcast. We'll be back next week with another episode of Tax Notes Talk.
Tax Notes Talk is a production of Tax Notes. You can learn more about us by visiting www.taxnotes.com/podcast. When major media wants the straight story, they turn to Tax Notes. Thank you for listening, and join us again for another edition of Tax Notes Talk. Want more like this? Subscribe for more tax videos. Special thanks to our executive producers, Jasper Smith and Paige Jones, showrunner and audio engineer, Jordan Parrish, and audio engineer, Peyton Rhodes.